It's no secret that I'm a big Fire Emblem fan, but I always have trouble answering the question of which game is my favorite. While I love the narrative ambition of games like FE4 and FE10, and can even respect FE14 for at least trying something novel, most of those aren't really my favorites to play. But if you want to talk dated mechanics, I'll take any of those over FE5 or FE6. I kind of lean toward FE16, despite all the fandom drama, for satisfying my not-so-inner completionist, even though I did start with FE7, so that's where the bulk of my nostalgia lies, rather than in FE13 like a lot of modern fandom. If you're also a Fire Emblem fan, but had trouble following along with what I was saying just now, or if you are familiar with this particular numbering system, but never really knew where it came from or why people use it, this video is for you. Because I totally understand why these numbers might seem like some obscure piece of internet knowledge. Because these games don't actually have numbers in their titles. Except for that one. And that one. You know what I mean. I consider Fire Emblem's fan-created numbering system to be a fascinating little piece of fandom cultural history. And as I don't recall ever seeing anyone else tackle this subject in a video, I figured I'd do the honors myself, as we're all about to welcome the release of FE17. That is, Fire Emblem Engage. Since we're talking about history, we're going to have to go all the way back. No, not that far. There we go. Super Smash Bros. Melee, released in 2001, is generally understood to be the game that first sparked international interest in Fire Emblem as a franchise when it included Marth and Roy in its roster. Intelligent Systems itself acknowledged as much when they advertised the Shadow Dragon Switch port in 2020. That curiosity was what prompted the first ever officially localized game in the series 2 years later, titled Fire Emblem. Is that it? Is this guy Roy? He looks kinda similar. Is this guy Marth? Blue hair aside, they look almost nothing alike. Rather understandably, the situation with this particular Game Boy Advance game sparked a fair amount of confusion, as well as what could be called the Western Fire Emblem fandom's first ever meme, asking if Marth and Roy are in this game. As it turns out, the one Fire Emblem game that we now had in English doesn't feature Marth at all, and Roy only appears as a small child in a cameo in the epilogue. There's no indication that this game is tied to anything else, aside from the surprisingly creepy stinger in the final scene heavily suggesting a sequel. Not even Melee's trophy descriptions are much help, simply telling us that Fire Emblem was, at least at the time, Japan only. Bear in mind that this was 2003, when the internet was much less centralized and information on Japan-exclusive games in the English-speaking world was fairly minimal, and mostly limited to the sorts of dedicated fans who could read Japanese and engage with those titles directly. The small fandom growing up around the game known simply as Fire Emblem did eventually learn through such fans that it was only the latest in a series that had been around for over a decade, and that was fairly beloved in Japan, hence the Super Smash Bros. Appearance. There were in fact 6 other games prior to the one that we got. 2 for the Famicom, known internationally as the NES, 3 for the Super Famicom, or SNES, and most significantly, 1 for the Game Boy Advance that had come out a year prior and did star Roy. It turns out that his appearance in Melee was even more of a marketing gimmick than Super Smash Bros. Is as a concept. It's just that it was a gimmick intended only for Japan. And to think, people nowadays complain when every new avatar shows up in the latest Smash, when Nintendo's been pulling this routine for 20 years. But back to those Japan-exclusive games. The fandom quickly realized that if we wanted to have informed conversations about this series, about its conventions and archetypes and the sorts of things we could reasonably expect from these titles going forward, we'd need to be able to talk about the games that were never released internationally. Each game in the series, including the latest, has a subtitle, at least in Japanese. Fans who could read the language render these in English like so. Not exactly the most intuitive set of subtitles. One's just a loan word, one's a not immediately obvious reference to an in-universe country and calendar, and 2 are clunky mouthfuls that I can only assume don't sound nearly as awkward in Japanese. Could you even imagine Intelligent Systems officially localizing this game with such a ridiculous-sounding subtitle as Genealogy of the Holy War? Oh. Okay then. Couldn't think of anything else there? There were a number of different methods people developed to navigate around this naming issue, like for example turning the translated subtitles into acronyms, or even doing the same to the Romanized Japanese subtitles, but none of them really stuck, in part because it was just harder to directly experience these games and then talk about them in an era when fan translations were in a rough state, to put it mildly. I don't think anyone knows for certain who exactly came up with the idea to cut through the confusion and just slap numbers on all these games, but given the small size of the fandom and the reference point of other long-running JRPG series that do number their games, it was likely a community effort. Just like that, we had a quick and easy way to refer to every Fire Emblem release. The first one with Marth in it, the one no one cared about until it got a remake, Japan's favorite, where Marth has pants now, the one with a big plot twist and also all the incest, the really f***ing hard one, the one with Roy in it, and of course, the game known officially as Fire Emblem that we now knew had a Japanese subtitle that translated to Blazing Sword, but that we could also simply refer to as FE7. There was an educational value to the system as well, because fans who didn't know about the Japanese games could now easily understand that the one game they had played was the 7th in a series, without having to know too many details about the other titles, or have to try to understand Fire Emblem's weird, inconsistent continuity as a franchise. With the numbers, you don't need to know right off that FE7 is a prequel to FE6, or that FE5 is a midquel to FE4. Instead, you can gradually acquire that information over time if you choose to learn more about the Japan-exclusive games, and maybe even try them out for yourself. The nice thing about numbers, too, is that they can be easily applied to future games, and that's exactly what happened following the releases of Sacred Stones, Path of Radiance, and Radiant Dawn, even though each of these games has an official localized subtitle. Some fans use the alternate system of turning those subtitles into acronyms, either because they weren't around when FE7 was current, or it was just easier for them. But those systems complement each other well, and it could sometimes be useful to have these two different labels that refer to the same game, like if you're writing long forum or blog posts about whether or not Micaiah is a Mary Sue, or whether Ike is gay. The answers to those questions, by the way, are no she's not, and oh my god, I am so sick of arguing about Ike. This has been going on for 15 fucking years and no one can ever let it rest. If you need me, I'll be over here enjoying Dimitri and his multitude of boyfriends instead. Anyway, the next game to be released, Shadow Dragon for the DS, threw a bit of a hitch in the system. Its visual style and some of its stranger elements of gameplay design were controversial enough, but it also brought the question of whether remakes deserve their own numbers. Most fans eventually decided that they did, in part because there was already established precedent to number remakes. FE3, Mystery of the Emblem, is itself divided into 2 separate books, with the first serving as a pared-down remake of Marth's first game with some extraneous chapters and characters removed so that it could fit on the same cartridge as the new campaign in Book 2. Perhaps most famously, this is the game that replaces Minor Heroes meme Riz with a vulnerary in its first chapter. As a result, as well as for simplicity's sake, fans got on board with calling Shadow Dragon for the DS FE11, at least when they weren't calling it FESD, which has the coincidental bonus of being reversible to FEDS. That is, Fire Emblem for the Nintendo DS. I wonder if that was intentional. Intelligent Systems had used a similar title gimmick with the first DS Advance Wars several years prior, after all. In any case, however, the follow-up game was cause for significantly more concern, as FE12, New Mystery of the Emblem, was the first game in nearly a decade to not see an international release, once again forcing fans who couldn't read Japanese to have to resort to emulators and unofficial translation patches if they wanted to play it. It made everyone a little nervous. The thought that dwindling sales and a perceived lack of interest in the West would lead to Fire Emblem becoming Japan exclusive again, or worse, becoming a dead franchise altogether. But then, of course, everything changed. No discussion of the Western Fire Emblem fandom's history is complete without a sharp division into before Awakening and after Awakening. It's impossible to overstate just how drastically this one title changed the landscape of the international fanbase for these games, and nearly a decade on, we're still feeling the effects. Fire Emblem is now one of Nintendo's big franchises, with nearly 10 releases in as many years, as many Smash reps as Pokémon, and the company's most profitable mobile game, although that one's just because Nintendo doesn't technically own Pokémon Go. Love or hate the design choices and appeals to particular demographics that garnered it such commercial success, there's no doubt that FE13 brought the series into the international spotlight like never before. Funny thing, though, about that FE13 bit. The influx of new players meant far more people were talking about these games now, and as the internet in the 2010s had begun to shift away from dedicated fan sites and onto broad social media platforms like Reddit, Twitter, and Tumblr, getting fans accustomed to the numbering system was no longer as simple as teaching a few dozen people on a forum in 2005 that FE8 referred to sacred stones. There was the perception that an alternate naming convention simply wasn't necessary anymore. Awakening already has a short, punchy subtitle, and that's more or less true for every mainline Fire Emblem release since. It was also around this time that Nintendo's localization teams at last began the gradual process of translating content from the Japanese-only games for a Western audience, in large part because Awakening's Spot Pass and DLC feature characters and maps from those games that otherwise would have had to have been removed from international releases. Not all of these Awakening localizations stuck in the end, but for the first time, fans were not all on their own when it came to naming and talking about all these older titles and the characters that came from them. This led into the ongoing localization work of Heroes, which launched a few years later and had to, by necessity, continuously translate new material from the Japan-only games for an international audience, even for something as relatively passive as voting in the annual Choose Your Legends polls. Between them, Awakening and Heroes even at last gave us officially localized subtitles for every single game, including the one that started this whole mess back in 2003. It makes sense then that the fan numbering system went through something of an identity crisis in the 2010s, as it became less of an immediately useful tool for fans and more of a relic of the pre-Awakening era that didn't seem to serve much purpose anymore, and was thus harder for newer players to grasp. It didn't help that Fire Emblem's release output in the years after Awakening greatly diversified compared to what had come before, with more collaborations, more spin-offs, and more gameplay experimentation that stretched the boundaries of what we understood Fire Emblem to look like, and made it very obvious that the numbering system was based on nothing official, but rather on common consensus. It was just a matter of what caught on first with the most number of people. Did the 3 roots of Fire Emblem Fates deserve to be numbered separately because they were sold separately? Nope, it's just FE14. Did the Echoes in Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia suggest a new sub-series that IS would use to develop future remakes, and therefore one that would exist outside the numbering system? Nope, remakes getting their own numbers was established back in the DS era, and anyway, 5 years on and we've yet to see another Echoes title. We just have to make do with the knowledge that all of these refer to the same game. What about Heroes? It's the commercial juggernaut of the series, and its influence has clearly crossed over into the newer releases, and yet, it doesn't get a number, at least as far as fans are concerned. Part of that is just typical elitism directed at mobile games, as well as contempt for Heroes' predatory gacha mechanic, but there's also arguments to be made that Heroes is ultimately more of a crossover event than a mainline title. and also that because it's persistently updated, it's kind of awkward to slot it into a fixed numbering system. If it had been given a number at the time of its launch in 2017, it would have been dubbed FE15. And it would be a little odd to talk about FE15 getting updates at the same time that we're getting hyped for the release of FE17. I'm aware that the numbered Final Fantasy MMOs accomplish that while also being persistently updated, but from everything I've seen, Final Fantasy games are referred to exclusively by their official numbers, whereas Fire Emblem's numbers have always been unofficial and have always competed with alternative naming systems. What began as an attempt to bring order to chaos and to make it easier to talk about such a large and disconnected franchise has increasingly become a way to draw a somewhat arbitrary distinction between mainline Fire Emblem and spin-off Fire Emblem. And I can imagine that for players who only got into the series more recently, that distinction can seem unnecessary. For someone who's only played Three Houses and Three Hopes, it probably doesn't seem too logical that the former game is given this numbered designation seemingly from nowhere, while the latter is dismissed as a lesser side piece that exists only as an extension of Three Houses. Whether we're talking about the world of Fodlan as a whole, or we're talking about the 3 years of endless circular discourse over who commits more war crimes. It's not even something that holds up according to the games themselves. In the trailer for Engage, there are clearly only 12 heroes from past games, and to get it up to 16, you'd have to count Marth 4 times and Celica twice. That's not hard to understand if you explain it to someone, but it's still a reminder that the numbering system has nothing to do with anything Nintendo or Intelligent Systems says, but rather was created in part to spite them all those years ago for trying to pass this game off as a standalone title when we knew from Melee that that wasn't the case. Even now, a full quarter of that circle of lords in the Engage trailer have never officially appeared outside of Japan, even with Sigurd featured prominently in the game's promotional material. And it suggests that the disconnect between these companies and their international fan bases remains decades after the initial misdirection with FE7. In that sense, I consider the numbers an example of the way in which fandoms can write their own narratives independent of the people who created the media that they're fans of, even if it's something as simple as referring to games by numbers that aren't really there. Where, though, does that leave us heading into 2023? I was one of the people who started referring to Fire Emblem Engage as FE17 as soon as it was announced, even as that designation is also a bit controversial as the game clearly borrows so much from Heroes. This is very much a subjective matter, and those of us who continue to use the numbering system do so with the understanding that it's no longer as widely known or accepted in the fandom, but that people tend to pick up on it regardless. For all I know, maybe this video is the first time you're hearing of it, and now you get to decide whether this is something worth using when you're talking about Fire Emblem. As for everyone else, do you use the numbering system? If you do, is it just out of habit, or do you think that there's still some value in it even now? Those are open-ended questions with no right answers, of course, and I'd love to read your thoughts on those in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching, and please be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel for more Fire Emblem content of all sorts, including Engage, or FE17, when it releases next month. Au revoir!